And if you have a Bible, if you could turn with me to Luke chapter 5. My name is Jonathan Domingo. I have the privilege of being the Latin America director for Far Reaching Ministries. And as Pastor John referenced, this church is particularly involved with Far Reaching Ministries as a whole over the last several years, but specifically what I get to do in Latin America, which is about 2.5 years ago, we started rescuing children from sex trafficking and organ harvesting, and an absolutely brutal but necessary ministry. But one of the things we realized is that it's not enough just to rescue children. Sadly, there's a system in place that propagates this kind of evil, and it's systemic. And so the only way do I need to put this a little bit closer to my mouth, or does it work right there? We're good right there? Okay. The only way that we can address something that goes so profoundly into not just the culture that's gone awry in Latin America, but in the world, because many of the clients that fly in are from America or from Western Europe, and so it's really across the board. The whole system is in shambles. But one of the things that brings me comfort, and should bring us all comfort, is that we understand this. Your life and my life without Jesus was pretty messed up. was pretty systematically and profoundly flawed. And you and I have presenced and experienced firsthand what it's like for God to take a life and redeem it, and transform it, and change it, and renew it. And so we believe in the power of the gospel and its ability to take broken people and make them whole. And so we believe that what applies for an individual, which is what we're going to see through the life of Peter in a second when we get to the passage, applies in general to people. And so I'm assuming you were already there in Luke chapter 5, but if you're not, as you're turning there, I do want to give you a little kind of history of who we are as a ministry. Far Reaching Ministries was started almost 30 years ago in Africa, specifically in Sudan. There was a civil war in which the Muslim North was doing raids into the Christian South, and very concerning, the worst genocide of the 21st century. Over 2 million people were killed in that war. And one of the things that they were doing was that they were targeting children, and this was very famous in the news. They would kidnap children. They would make the boys soldiers. And so you'd have pictures of a 9-year-old with an AK-47, and then they would take the girls to abuse them as well. And so we started training the local village pastors to protect their villages from these raids. And so over time that evolved, and if most people that are familiar with Far Reaching Ministries know us because of our chaplaincy program in Sudan. We've trained about 700 chaplains. We have about 400 active chaplains. And so we have pastors, people that are pastors in their local villages. They're chaplains within the army, and they're also frontline soldiers, because contrary to the reality in America or in Western Europe, they don't have the luxury to have chaplains that are solely doing faith-based ministry. They have to be on the front lines. And so because of that, we've lost 73 of our men in action. And so we're a ministry that knows pain. We're a ministry that knows war. We're in 6 active war zones currently. We've expanded to almost 40 different countries around the world. And we're involved in pretty much the entire Middle East. We started something that we called Ghost Operations, which is the invisible hand of the Western church training and funding the underground church in the Middle East. Say that 3 times fast. And so we're involved in some of the most dangerous parts around the world. In Afghanistan, when we pulled out and the country imploded, you remember the images of people holding on to landing gear of plane as they were taking off and falling to their death. And we had about 200 people there in that country, between our pastors, their families, their small churches. They were all targeted, literally on lists for the Taliban to be killed. And so we were able to mount a rescue operation to rescue all 200 of our people from Afghanistan. To this day, almost 4.5 years later, we're still rescuing people. We've been able to rescue 2,800 people that would have been killed by the Taliban. Otherwise, the only ministry to our knowledge that is still doing this. And so, like I said, we're involved all over the place. We're heavily involved in Ukraine. We'll have an opportunity at the end of the service, if you'd like to sponsor one of the children that we have in our system, in our orphanages. We have 2 orphanages currently. We just bought 16 acres overlooking a lake in western Ukraine. It's beautiful. It looks like Austria. And the war has provoked and has caused tens of thousands of children to be orphaned, legitimately orphaned, not just losing their dads, but their mothers as well. Because what happens is the dads will be off at a war, and the mothers will be with their children, but the ones that are on the front line, literally going to get water or going to get supplies means you could be targeted by a drone. And so many of these children are in bunkers, are in basements, and their mother never came back. And so I know how politicized, and it gets more and more politicized, the subject of Ukraine is. But the reality is, because we're there, boots on ground, 200,000 children, Ukrainian children, have been removed from their homes and sent to Russia to be indoctrinated in the Russian worldview, so that after the war they can be sent back to Ukraine, ethnically Ukrainian, but with the Russian mindset. 200,000. Like I said, tens of thousands of children that are orphaned. And so it's just a huge need. And I know as Christians, it's difficult. Because as Christians, we also tend to think about things broader than just, it's not just the war. There's more things happening there. And so when you factor things in, we'll get people approach us and ask us all the time, should we be involved in Ukraine? Isn't it not other people's business? Or what I get all the time is, isn't the government in Ukraine corrupt? I'm Mexican, born and raised. Still live in Mexico. English is my second language. My dad is a missionary, which is why I speak English. And as somebody who's been around corruption their entire life, because sadly Mexico is notorious for its corruption within the government, within the law enforcement, I can say without a shadow of a doubt that there is corruption in the Ukrainian government. I've also heard that there is some corruption in the United States government. Don't know for a fact. Don't quote me on that. But if our involvement hinges on corruption being eradicated from governments for us to be able to help an orphan or a widow or the broken or the hungry, is there any country in the world where we could be light as Jesus commanded us to be? So we understand that we kind of in a difficult situation, but we believe that wherever there's people hurting, there's a need for the gospel to be preached. Because we're not just a ministry that provides housing or clothing or food. The heart of who we are as a ministry is that we're a church planting, gospel preaching ministry. Because we understand that the hope of the world is the message of Jesus Christ. And the more people that can be transformed by this message, that is when the light of the gospel goes forth into the darkness and transforms. I already told you what I get to do, which is the Latin America area of our ministry. We started planting churches 2 years ago. We planted 7 churches the first year. We planted 6 churches last year, and we have 12 churches in the chute this year to plant. One of the original 7 churches is the church that you're involved with, so personal gratitude for that. And so yeah, if you have your Bible, like I've said a couple times already, I'm going to be reading out of Luke chapter 5. I'm going to read the entire passage, and then we'll pray, and then we'll consider some thoughts from the interaction between Jesus and Peter. Luke 5, verses 1 through 11 says, "So it was, as the multitude pressed about him," that's Jesus, "to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesareth. He saw 2 boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. He then got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little bit from land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he stopped speaking, he said to Simon, 'Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch.' But Simon answered and said to him, 'Master, we have toiled all night and have caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net.' And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. Jesus, I thank you so much for the opportunity to consider your word together. I thank you so much for this church. I pray that we would be inspired, that we would know without a shadow of a doubt that like Peter, you have called us to be fishers of men. That you have called us to be fearless before opposition. That you've called us to truly believe in the deepest part of our souls that we were placed on this earth not just to traverse life and make it on the other side, but as we live life, to live with the urgency of a man who has found the cure and wants many other people to experience that same salvation. So I pray that you would convince us of that in Jesus' name. Amen. I don't know about you, but whenever I read this story, I just assumed that this was the way that Jesus and Peter met. That Jesus was an itinerant speaker, and he had a crowd with him, and he couldn't really preach because the crowd, it says, it was pressing up against him, and so he sees a fisherman, gets the bright idea to borrow his boat, get in the boat, use the shoreline as a natural amphitheater, preach. Afterwards tells the fisherman, "Hey, let's go fishing." They have a miraculous catch. Peter launches himself at Jesus' feet. Jesus says, "Do not fear, from now on you will be a fisher of men." And that's the story of how Peter was called. Nevertheless, people that look at the four Gospels and piece them together to have a chronological sequence of the events tell us that this is in fact, without a shadow of a doubt, but this is in fact not the first time that Peter and Jesus met. On the contrary, when they meet, it's under completely different circumstances. It's not in the Jordan, or it's rather not in the Sea of Galilee, it's in the Jordan River. And Peter was first, this is found in the Gospel of John, Peter was first a disciple of John the Baptist before he becomes a disciple of Jesus. And so by the time this happens, they've made their way up to Galilee again, which means that it's been likely months that Peter has been with Jesus as his disciple, having left everything to follow him. And so that paints this story in a different light, because now it begs the question. What's obviously happening in this story is that Peter is having his awareness and his eyes open to the fact that Jesus is not just a teacher or a rabbi or a preacher, but there's something significantly greater. Because when he launches himself at Jesus' feet and says, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord," that's a first century Jewish way of saying, "I believe you to be God." Because every single person in the Old Testament that believes themselves to be in God's presence are afraid they're going to die. Because the Jewish worldview is different than the Christian worldview. Because our worldview is that the veil that separated us from God was torn when Jesus died, and that through his resurrection, we now, through faith, have access. And it even says in Hebrews something so outstanding. It says that we can approach the throne with boldness. That's not the Old Testament worldview. The Old Testament worldview is that God is so radiant and holy, and he is just so other that human beings cannot be in his presence without being zapped. You can see it literally. Look through your Old Testament. Every single time somebody believes themselves to be in God's presence, they're afraid they're going to die, which is exactly what's happening with Peter. In the worldview for the Jews is God is so powerful that for me to be in his presence would be like a fly trying to land on the surface of the sun, all-consuming. And so when people say, the New Testament doesn't say that Jesus is God, it says it all over the place, but it's a little subtle. But when he says, from a miraculous catch, He says, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord." That is a clear statement of Peter believing Jesus to be God in human form. So that begs the question, what took him months? You'd think that within 13 minutes of meeting Jesus, you'd be like, okay, he's other. He's definitely not just human. But it took him months. And that begs the question, why? Or maybe even a greater question. If Peter could have been physically with Jesus and not realize who Jesus is it possible for us to be followers of Jesus without having that moment where the eyes of our soul gain clarity to be able to see with precision who Jesus really is? That brings me to my first of 4 points for us this morning. Point number 1 is being with Jesus does not necessarily mean we know Jesus. I'm just using Peter as an example. He followed Jesus, loved Jesus, obeyed Jesus, sacrificed for Jesus, had his worldview shaped by Jesus, and still did not fully understand who Jesus is, or was, or is. So I don't want you to raise your hand, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I do want you to ponder this question in your soul. I know from my own life and from traveling and speaking in enough places that this is a reality for many Christians. So don't raise your hand, but how many people would describe their spiritual relationship with Jesus in this way? I love him. I want to obey him. I've made sacrifices to be with him. My worldview has been shaped by him. But if I'm honest, in the depth of my soul, I know I'm not enjoying the depth of intimacy that I long to have with him. Man, I know that is so true for so many people. It's not that you lack genuineness. It's that you lack depth. And so the question is, if we're genuine, isn't that enough? And the answer is kind of. Because Peter got there, but what did it take? That leads me to my second point. So we're taking notes. First point is being with Jesus does not necessarily mean you know Jesus. Point number 2 is it is in deep waters where you will find him. So Jesus tells Peter, I love it how it says in the New King James, let's venture out into the deep. Now, something that's very important when we study the Bible in general, but the Gospels more specifically, is that every single, and I'm not exaggerating, every single story in the Gospels is there for 2 reasons, not just one. It's there to tell us what happened, but also it's there to illustrate a spiritual principle. Writing in antiquity was expensive. John himself says, if we were to write down everything that Jesus said and did, there wouldn't be books enough in the entire world to be able to write down everything that Jesus said and did. Which means they're extremely selective with the stories they choose to share, which means this is not just a story about fishing. This is a story about somebody being called to greater purpose. Somebody being called into intimacy and depth in their relationship with God. And so when Jesus says, let's go into the deep, it's not just Jesus saying the fish are out there. He's saying, do you want a deeper relationship with me? Do you want to go beyond the surface level? You have to be willing to face deep waters. And I really like how this works in English because it's an idiom. When we say somebody's going through deep waters, we're familiar with that phrase. What does that mean? It means that they're going through a season of testing, of uncertainty, of trials, of storms. Here's the big idea. The intimacy you desire with God is on the other side of the storms you want to avoid. I'll say it again. The intimacy with God that you desire is on the other side of the storms that you're avoiding, that you wish you didn't have to go through. And gosh, I can see it. I don't know how long most of you have been Christians, but I can see it in some faces, the reality. That you've been through storms and you can say from personal experience, yeah, it wasn't until I was whipped by a storm that my relationship with God really had that value and that depth and that intimacy. And I can also see it. Some people that are new Christians are like, I wasn't told that when I prayed to receive Jesus. Well, I'm telling you now. And many churches, particularly Calvary Chapels, do a good job of warning people what C.S. Lewis said, which is if you're looking for a religion that makes you comfortable, I would not recommend Christianity. Because implicit in the following is the take up your cross and follow me. You know, we love the promises of God. I grew up in an era in Christian pop culture where the promises of God had a lot of focus, meaning this. You guys remember? And I kind of wish we would bring it back. Like every single Christian calendar, mug, magnet on a fridge, bumper sticker on a car was like, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. You know, and we would just, did you guys remember that there would be like a loaf of bread, like a porcelain loaf of bread that had like little cardboard things, and you would just pull out a cardboard, and there were all the promises of God, and that was wonderful. We'd have them stitched on pillows and printed on mugs. You know what promise I never saw printed on a mug? What Jesus said. In this world you will have tribulation. The least, quoted promise of the Bible is that. But that's not the entire promise. In this world you will have tribulations, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. And I might even like it more the way the psalmist said it. This is very familiar to all of us. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Dear Christian brother or sister, God has intimacy for you. But that intimacy will not be experienced until you're on the other side of the storm that you're dreading or currently going through. Some of you are in the eye of the storm right now. You're like, yeah, where is that intimacy? You know, one of the cheesiest things that Christians have ever created is the footprints in the sand poster. So cheesy. But once again, early 2000s is the era where I grew up. It was on every pastor's office. It was there for a reason. Because when you're in the storm, sometimes you don't see it. In hindsight, it's 2020, and you're like, my goodness, it wasn't my strength. It wasn't my wherewithal. It wasn't my power. It wasn't my discipline that was pulling me through. I did not pull myself up from my bootstraps. I did not dig down and hunker in. It was God's grace and God's power and God's arms that carried me through the part of the storm where I was weakest. But I wish we could see that in the moment. But sometimes it's not until you're on the other side of the storm that you realize God carried me. And like a child, I've got kids. I've got a 12-year-old, 9-year-old, and 3-year-old. And there's sacrifices as a parent that I've made that they won't realize till they're 30. Because I'm 36, and I'm just barely realizing the sacrifices my parents made for me. And likewise, there'll be things in your spiritual walk that you didn't realize God was so gracious to give to you because it's something that only time reveals. I don't remember who said this. Lady Julian of Norwich said this. First, there is a fall, and then we recover from the fall. Both are the mercy of God. First, there's the storm. And then the storm passes. And then we realize that they were both the mercy of God. Because the storm feels terrible. but the growth it affords us, we cannot find it any other way. Point number 1, being with Jesus does not necessarily mean you know Jesus. Point number 2, it's in deep waters where we find him. Point number 3, before he uses you, he will allow you to come to the end of yourself. So Jesus tells Peter, let's go to the deep. Let's venture in deep waters. And Peter has an excuse, which to me sounds pretty valid. He wants to say no. He says, Master, we've toiled all night and have caught nothing. I want you to picture this. You've fished all night, not with a fishing rod, but with nets and 2 boats, where you're doing big circles looking to capture large amount of fish. This is before you have the mechanisms, the pulleys to do the heavy lifting for you. So it's back-breaking work to throw the nets and pull them out by hand every single time, just to find out these heavy water-drenched nets are empty. And you do that once, then you do it twice, then you do it for an hour, then you do it for 12 hours and still come up empty-handed. It tells us at the beginning of the story that Peter had washed his nets. So nets are washed. You know, the salt water is bad for ropes, and so you have to wash them out with regular water, with water that isn't salty. And after that, after pulling an all-nighter and hearing Jesus speak for who knows how long, maybe an hour or 2, and your net's being cleaned, you're just so ready to go home and get some sleep. And it's in that context that Jesus says, do you want to go fishing? I do not blame Peter for being like, Jesus, sounds great. How about tomorrow? And we give Peter a hard time because there's so many things that Peter does that are almost ridiculous. But I think this is one of his great moments where he says, Master, we've toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the nets for a catch. You hear the faith in that? You hear the obedience? Even, it's like Romans talking about Abraham. It says he believed counter to belief. That's translated from Spanish to English. But he believed against all odds would be maybe another way to say it. And it doesn't make sense. If you were fishing all night and caught nothing, and Jesus says, let's go fishing, logic says, if at night, when it's the best fishing, we didn't get anything, and Jesus has been preaching and projecting his voice and scaring off whatever fish might have been there in the first place, it doesn't make sense. But Jesus, if you say so, I'll do it. Love that about Peter. The question is, if that's the case, and Peter's a lifelong fisherman, and he's fishing with 2 boats and a huge industrial-sized net, how did he come up empty-handed so many times? And I believe that God's hand was in the miracle. I need to be careful with how I say this, but I also believe that God's hand was in the failure as well. Not provoking it, I don't think, because I don't think that's good theology. But there's a reason why God allows failure. And it's not because he's angry, and it's not because he's this kind of God that's like, he needs a little bit of suffering. Teach him a lesson. But rather, I believe, and it takes a little bit of faith for you to believe it, but I believe that God has such large and beautiful plans for you that if you didn't go through a season of failure prior, your ego and your pride would wreak havoc in your life. Amen. And so God allows, oftentimes, and you can look at this all over the Bible, God will allow a season of failure before he uses you. So, failure does not mean God is finished with you. It might mean that he's preparing you. What would have happened to Peter if he would have had the miraculous catch and didn't have the failure the night before? We that know Peter's personality, do you think he would have automatically assumed it was God doing it? Or do you think he would have been like, I am, without a doubt, the best fisherman in all of Galilee? But it was a failure the night before that made him realize this is not the result of my own effort. But like it says in James, that every good and perfect gift comes from above. And just like storms are really difficult, and it says that no correction is joyous in the moment, but afterwards it leads to fruits of righteousness. In the same way, failure is never something that we look forward to. On the contrary, it's quite miserable. But it's necessary for two reasons. One, God will use you. God will use Peter. It's in that context, and he says, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be a fisher of men. But also, Peter had one more failure. A couple failures, but one really famous failure. Still up ahead. And might it have been that God is just preparing him for that too? That your failure is not final. I mean, have you ever been betrayed by somebody you love? Doesn't it feel horrendous? If I were God, I don't know if I'd give Peter a second chance. If I were God and I was on my way to be tried and sentenced in a phony trial, and Peter, it says in Luke, warming himself in the same fire where my accusers are, and it says in Luke's kind of a jerk for including this, but it says in Luke that he cursed Jesus, and then he saw him and made eye contact with him. Can you imagine that being Jesus? Walking to redeem the sins of humanity, and one of your closest friends says, I don't know that, insert word of choice person, and then make eye contact with Jesus. I don't know. I'm so glad I'm not God. Because I don't know if I could be like, a couple days later, hey, you love me? Feed my sheep. I'd be like, I'm never talking to you again. But aren't you glad Jesus is not like that? Even with Judas, it tells us in the story that when Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, this is what Jesus says. Friend, do what you came to do. When I read that, I can't help but cry. Friend. Friend. You know what's interesting about that is that there are several words in Greek for friend. And that word friend really is comrade or even brothers in arms. It's the same word that Alexander the Great used for his own personal bodyguard. Friend. Let me tell you this. I don't know what failure you have. It doesn't change how much God loves you. And it doesn't change the fact that God wants to use you. And you might feel like you've been put on the back burner. You might feel like right now it's not a season of fruitfulness, and it might not be. The failure might be large enough to where you need a season of healing yourself. But for a Christian, for a child of God, failure is not ultimate and it's not final. There's more chapters to be written of God's grace, and God will continue to use you. I promise you that. So point number one, being with Jesus does not necessarily mean you know him. Point number two is, let me look at my notes. It's in deep waters where we will find him. Point number three, before he uses you, he will allow you to come to the end of yourself. And point number four, we must abandon all to follow him. So after the miraculous catch, Peter leaves even the miraculous catch to follow Jesus. Now that's significant. And I do think, because in the other Gospels, it tells us that right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, there's people that are eager to follow Jesus and say, hey, I'll follow you, let me bury my parents first. And he says, hey, let the dead bury their own dead. And somebody comes, I'll follow you, but let me get my inheritance money first. And say, hey, foxes have holes and or birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to rest his head. And he said, no. Might it be that Peter has seen that and he doesn't want to risk Jesus walking away? And so even though he's already got a miraculous catch, he leaves even that. Once again, I might be speaking too negatively about myself, but if I were to receive a miraculous catch, and it's tens of thousands of dollars worth of fish, I would say, Jesus, love the idea, fishers of men, sign me up, give me 48 hours, I'll sell the fish, and we'll leave with some money in our pockets. But he abandons all, even the miraculous catch, because I believe that Peter understood this implicitly. It is impossible to be used by God without letting go, without sacrificing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis for opposing the Nazi regime, said this: when God calls a man, he bids him come and die. And this isn't hyperbole for the majority of Christians around the world. We have somebody who just joined our team. He's been a senior pastor for a couple decades, and he said, yeah, it's a reality that we're serving in really difficult places, and there's people in our team that are facing situations where their life are at risk. And I said, I need you to know something. Your life is now at risk. Because the organization we work for goes to places and does things that are horribly unsafe. We were just in Ukraine, spent 4 days in the front lines. There was places like Pokrovsk where the artillery and the missiles were so back to back that there was not a moment of silence. It felt like a scene out of Saving Private Ryan. And there was live craters with fire coming from them, and the chaplains that were hosting us were listening to like hardcore music driving through it, just pupils dilated, and it was war. That's not safe. One of those nights we were in a building, and artillery hit will take out a car, a ballistic missile will take out a city block. We went to a place where we saw an 18-story apartment complex leveled to the ground. I mean, so much so that literally it caves into the crater that it leaves. And as we were about to fall asleep midnight, a ballistic missile landed a couple blocks from our hotel and was the loudest noise I have ever heard. You know how when you're about to fall asleep and just like the little beeps and tinkers and people walking down the street and you can hear everything and you're like, shut up, I'm in a war zone, I want to sleep, And then boom. I mean, I was probably 10 stories up, and the building swayed. I don't know how it didn't crack the windows, but I've been in earthquakes, and it was like an earthquake. And the people went out with flashlights to try to see where it landed. I remember praying, feeling this small, and just feeling like the Russians were the thumb of a 10-year-old and I was an ant. And about 5 minutes later, another one landed. I remember praying, thinking, maybe the next words I will tell Jesus in person. And a third one landed. And we left the front lines, went and got breakfast with some chaplains a couple hours away. And to be honest, I've been in a lot of really gnarly things in Latin America. I've been, crossfire and into really gnarly, criminally controlled territories, and never felt as unsafe as I did in that moment. But this is true. I don't see that many Hispanic people in the crowd. This is just really true to my culture. We process tragedy through humor. I don't think this is as true in American culture. But as Mexicans, when things are really bad, we come up with the most phenomenal jokes. There's even Mexicans, we know this. The best jokes you will hear in your life will be at 2 a.m. at a funeral. It's just the way we kind of deal with hardships. And there's a lot of hardships in Latin America. So I assumed that when I shared this, they would get a kick out of it. Because if you're living that every day, it is almost like hee hee ha ha, the missionary was scared out of his wits. And when I shared what happened, there was a handful of chaplains. I was right next to not an older, who was in his 50s, but looked really worn, just exhausted, red-eyed, bags under his eyes, just the face of war. As I started sharing what happened the night before, he started crying. And he said, Jonathan, you'll never forget this moment. He said, look around you. All of us remember what it was like to be close to a missile landing. And he said it through an interpreter, but it was so precise. He said, you feel so small. And you realize in that moment that the majority of people live for things that are of no value. And the only thing that really matters is what you do for Jesus. And I realized his faith is greater than mine because his storm is greater than mine. And when I heard him, I realized, yeah, there is an intimacy in the storm that is unattainable any other way. And even in Latin America, we have a pastor who had 12 people massacred about 2 blocks away from his church. So just imagine. And I called him when I heard. We actually live in the same district, about an hour away. And I called him and I said, hey, are you okay? He's like, yeah, we're all right. He's got 3 young kids. He's an American missionary. I said, are you concerned about your family's safety? And he said, you know what, Jonathan? We haven't really had time to think about that. You want to know what my gut response was? Even living in that, even being in this kind of ministry, I was like, man, that's irresponsible. Then I thought about, we have 100 missionaries in Nigeria. We have missionaries that have died within weeks of reaching their northern Nigeria Muslim mission fields. Do you think they're going to northern Nigeria pretty much with a death sentence, concerned about their personal safety? Or are they realizing God has called me? And when God calls a man, he bids him come and die. Final story, when I was pastoring, I was a pastor for 12 years before coming on board with Far Reaching Ministries. I had somebody come up asking for prayer. He had a bullet wound in his foot. And so I asked him, I said, hey, why are you wounded? He said, I was a hitman for the most well-known Mexican criminal for 20 years. He was still young, he was early 40s. And I became a Christian, my wife and I did, and so I approached my boss and I said, hey, I can't work for you anymore, I'm a Christian, which is pretty gutsy in and of itself. But he was on such good terms with his boss. In his words, I was so good at my job, as I dryly swallowed. I was so good at my job, got stellar performance reviews, that my boss allowed me to retire. And so for 4 years, he was out of the criminal enterprise and living a semi-normal life until his former boss's son found him and said, I need you to work for me. He said, I can't, I'm a Christian. And so he shot him in the foot and said, you got 24 hours to change your mind or you and your entire family are going to die. And so when he was telling me this, I thought he was going to say, Jonathan, pray for me that I might have wisdom to know what to do. He said, Jonathan, pray for me that I might have the courage to die well. And I never heard from him again. And I know how it works. Him and his entire family died. And that's just an hour on the other side of the border, where people realize this might cost me everything. But the flip side is, what does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul? The flip side of that is, he who loses his life for my sake will find it. I shared that story at a pastor's conference, and the pastor was behind me. I was just giving a little share time. And he said this. When I shared that story, he said, wow, that is a life well lived. I was like, yeah. He didn't make it to 80, didn't have a retirement home, didn't have a 401k, but he heard, well done, good and faithful servant. And that's a life well lived. Because when God calls a man, he bids him come and die. And this is the way that cultures are changed, by the preaching of the gospel. And how do I know this? Because I'm a first-hand witness to the power of the gospel. Because my grandfather, on my mother's side, was a top drug dealer in a border city in Mexico. So much so, he was killed 60 years ago, so much so that I went back to that city, and when I talked to people about my mother's maiden name, they said, oh, yeah, we know that name. That's my grandfather. And if you know anything about psychology, people that grow up in that environment will usually stay in that environment, fall in love with a criminal, marry a criminal. But my mother, instead of marrying a criminal, she became a Christian and married a Christian missionary and pastor. So how different is my mom's life because somebody preached the gospel to her? How different is my life and my kids' life because somebody preached the gospel? We ought to do for one what we wish we could do for all, and that's how the world has changed. So the way you can participate in this is that when we travel, we give the churches we go to opportunities to sponsor, whether it be children or pastors or missionaries. And so I have 3 areas where you could choose to sponsor if you'd like. The first one is the church planters in Latin America. So for each of these, it's $75 a month. Obviously, that doesn't cover the needs for the individuals. We have to raise several sponsors for each pastor, missionary, or child. But if you'd like to sponsor a church planter in Latin America, it's $75 a month. Then we have the children in Ukraine. Like I said, we have 2 homes that are currently operational and 1 very large home that is being built. And so if you'd like to sponsor a child in Ukraine, you can as well for $75. And then we also have our pastors in the Middle East. We've got about 6 new pastors that we're looking to sponsor. And so if you'd like to sponsor one of the pastors, missionaries, when we travel, it's very important for us to make this clear. Please do not take from what you're giving to your local church to sponsor one of our pastors, to give to our ministry. We do not want you to sacrifice what you're giving to your local church to further your local mission in order to appease your conscience and say, hey, well, I'm sponsoring without it costing me anything. Once again, when God calls a man, there's a sacrifice. And so I know how compelling this is, and I know how it's easy to say, okay, well, this is the pot I have for God things. And so I'm just going to transfer from that fund to if you're going to sponsor one of our people, please do it above and beyond what you're currently giving to your local church. And I think God will bless that. For some people, that means maybe can't sponsor right now. For the majority of people, $75 a month we believe is very doable. I live in Mexico. I have 3 kids. If I go out to dinner with them and spend less than $75, we nailed it. And so it's what it costs. So for a cost for dinner with my family, I can make a big difference in the life of a pastor, in the life of a child. And also we get this asked every weekend. If it caps out at 1, you can sponsor a child and a pastor or several. It's whatever God places on your heart. But once again, we ought to do for one what we wish we could do for all. We have code names for everything we do. One of our homes is Little Starfish. There's a story of a storm that blew out a ton of starfish out on the sand, tens of thousands of them. There's a child throwing them back in the water knowing that they'll die if they don't. And somebody yells out and says, there's too many of them. You're wasting your time. What you're doing doesn't matter. And as he throws one in, he says, it mattered to that one. That is how we change the world. Jesus, I thank you so much for the opportunity to serve. We pray for these people that are on mission, that are changing the world, that we might know you've called us to be fishers of men as well, here, locally, but also be the ones that hold the rope so that others can go down and rescue and be light. I thank you so much for this church and its hearts for missions and its pastor. I pray that you bless them. In Jesus' name, amen.